This video will provide you an in-depth look into some of the formulas used in Excel and how you can use them to your advantage and how to prevent them from creating a disadvantage to you. To start off, take a look at pasting. And where pasting can sometimes be a problem is when you're moving formulas around and you don't know that. You think they're simply numbers. So three things are important to know. One is how to move formulas, how to move numbers, and how to flip numbers around and transpose data. So looks like a pretty standard set of numbers here. We got 77, we got and a bunch of other numbers that are entered in here. You can tell that they're entered strictly as numbers because if you click the box and look at the formula, it is just a number itself. There's no formula. Same story for this column here. If you move over here to this column, you can see, oh, that's not 77. That's actually B3 times A3, a multiplication of those two numbers. And same thing all up and down the line. So if you're to copy this group of cells here and say, okay, I want that group of data over here instead, and you paste it, it appears, no problem. If you are looking at these numbers here that resulted from the formula and you say, okay, I would like to move those numbers to this column over here, and you paste them, something strange happens. You get a bunch of zeros because when you think about it as the machine does, what is going on in column G is you're asking it to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 columns to the left and multiply that value times 6 columns to the left. And so when you move that formula over here and you say, okay, multiply 6 columns to the left of 7 columns, well, it turns out to be those are blank columns, and so that won't work. So if you want these formulas moved over there, not formulas, but these numbers that resulted from the formulas, and you're not trying to move the formula at all, you can copy this, go to the destination cells, and let me drag this down and show it shown. You can do the paste values command, and those values move over, and everything has worked out quite well. So let's say you have a data entry sheet that looks like this, where these are your data elements here, and it turns out to be that it's way more convenient for you to add data by just working in a vertical column as you're doing it several times to the right, but you want your data to appear, you want the axes of your data to be different, meaning that you want the dates to be a column, you want the name to be a column, and so forth. Well, what you can do, let me get rid of this, is you can select the data that you want to have moved, copy it, and then go to the Edit pull-down menu, and then the dialog box Paste Special is selected, and then, oops, did this wrong, copy my data, select a destination cell, then go to Paste Special, and then click the Transpose button, and once you hit that, the same data here has been copied, but on a completely different axis, where date now has become a column, name has become a column, etc. You might notice that these dates are numbers. All you have to do is select your format to be a date instead of a number, and you are completely off to the races. Looking pretty good. Okay, so those are things that are good to know about pasting, and that is if you cut and paste a number from one place to another, it'll appear no problem. If you cut and paste a formula, the formula has relative positions for the data elements, and those will be the ones that are moved, not your data itself. And then when you're transposing data, you can change axes around. Actually, one other thing that's worth noting here is, let's say, back to this formula here, you really want that formula resulting from these two elements to appear in column E rather than column G. Turns out to be that if you cut this whole array of formulas and you move it to the new cells, basically it'll say, okay, we know you really wanted to multiply these two together. It appears you want that to happen in column E rather than column I, so we're just going to make a wholesale change of your formula. Rather than 6 and 7 boxes to the left, we're going to go 4 and 5 boxes to your left. And so you can actually, if you cut and paste formulas, they will actually hang on to the same origin cells. So you don't have to go in here and type the new formula again and recreate the wheel there. So that's kind of a nice thing. So let's talk about dates. In the prior example, you saw that dates can interconvert between dates and numbers pretty easily. And that is controlled by the column, or the format cells command. So for example here, I've selected column D and I've pushed Command 1 on my Macintosh, and it could be Control 1 on a PC. And by clicking different formats here, I can convert these numbers back and forth between dates and numbers, or I can convert numbers to percents and numbers with 1 decimal point, 2, 5, 10, whatever. So when it comes to the date format, there are two things that are good to know. The one is the top of this column, and these are all different ways of presenting dates. It could be month, year like this. It could be, with the typical slash marks. But if you select this one here, that means whatever date you'll enter, if you don't put the year down, it'll put down the current year. And so that's really great if you're just entering in data like somebody just got admitted. I'm going to type in 3/14 for March 14th, and then it will autocomplete the year. So for example, I'm going to select that format. In here, I'm going to go 3/14. And you remember the prior dates were all 2006, but here it's saying, okay, when you do 3/14, we're going to enter this year in. And call it 2019. So I don't want to do that. So that's great if you're entering in data now, but if you're entering data from prior years, or you're moving data around and you want to basically make sure that the year that's entered in that data element is not going to be changed in any way, I usually go for this date format here, which is the next to the last one in this whole column. And that becomes my way of looking at the dates. So here's something that's pretty tricky. As I mentioned, dates can be interchanged with numbers. And so that means there's got to be a date that's considered date number 0 and date number 1 and so forth. And so the reference point for date equals day number 1 is basically January 1st, 1900. At least that's the way it is for PC computers. And for Microsoft on Excel on Macs, it's January 1st, 1904. Don't ask me why they did that, but that's the deal. And this can create a problem when somebody's sending you a data sheet that they've created on a PC and you're working on a Mac, or vice versa. You'll take a look at the dates and you'll just realize, wait a minute, they are way off. They're off by pretty close to 4 years. What do I do? And so then you'll try like copying the dates and then pasting the values, and just your computer will not let you have the date you want. It's going to drive you nuts. In fact, you're going to pick up a date that says 2006 and you paste it and it's going to be 2010. So here's the way to control it. You just have to kind of be with it and understand that the difference between this date and this date is the number 1462. So I'll use this spreadsheet here as an example once again. Let's say that these dates are completely off, and I moved some dates from that somebody sent me on a Macintosh. I pasted on my PC, and they're just completely wrong. So I could create a column over here and call it corrected or something like that, and then say, okay, I've lost this game of the date. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole column of data and I'm going to say, you know, the contents of this destination cell is going to be equal to 1462 plus whatever date is here. And look at this. Now I'm going to get dates that I like. And I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to paste it for the whole spreadsheet. And then what I can do is once I have this date corrected, I can copy that and move it over here. Or can I? Oh no, I'm getting weird formulas because basically, remember what I've done? I've told the computer add 1462 to something that's 12 columns to the left. And when you do that, this just says, hey, I can't find it. What's the deal? So here's what you got to do. You go back to the numbers that you have, copy these data, paste the values. So now this is no longer a formula. This is a hard and fast date. And now I'm going to copy those dates. I'm just going to paste them over here, and everything is back to normal. These are the dates that I really want to work with. Those are the correct dates. I am done. So depending on the dates that you get, if you get sort of the goofy date phenomena going on for you, you're going to just create another column, either 1462 plus whatever date it is, or whatever date it is minus 1462, and you'll get a correct date. Copy the formula, paste the results, move the results over. You'll be 10 times happier. It'll go really quickly, and you won't have a big problem with that anymore. So let's talk about times. You might have data that indicates times of day, and if you really want to manipulate the times of day and do analysis of or actually charts of number of calls or number of events at different times of the day, it's really important to try to break these times or condense these times into intervals of 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, whatever. But if you use time as a continuous variable, your data is just going to be spread out all over, because if you have a call that comes in at like 3:15, 3:16, 3:17, 3:14, 3:12, each one of those will become an entry on a histogram rather than rounding to the nearest 15 minutes, 5 calls for 3:15. So in kind of looking at data and trying to make sense of it, it's much better to try to break it down into discrete intervals. So let's say that we have a date written in cell number B2. So this is what the command is going to look like. It's called equals mround. And then you enter B2 times 24 in closed brackets, and then outer brackets around that. Actually, there should be a comma here. And then you enter in 0.25, which means the nearest quarter hour. So this is what the data looks like when you do that. So I have dates and times here, and so 1345, when applied to this formula, becomes 13.75, or 13 3/4. And so it's a little disorienting to look at, but the numbers that appear to the right of the decimal column are either zeros, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75. So quarter hours, so not minutes. So 2244, that rounds to 22 3/4. And basically the formula, the mround formula, is what I've typed here. And that's how you do it. And then what I could do is use pivot tables or something else to just condense a huge array of data using these kind of converted times and getting frequencies for each one of those intervals. And then I have data that could be plotted directly, and I could just look at it and see how my calls are spread out over a 24-hour clock. Super convenient way of working with times and to create easy to recognize data or easier to analyze and visualize. Now on to VLOOKUP. This is a very powerful formula that's used for combining data elements in one database with data to another. So I'll give you an example and then we'll talk about just the format here as a review when we're all done. So use this database here again. Sorry about the size. Let me just shrink it down to fit the screen here. Okay, so this is my sample met database here. And individual patients are identified by this column F called fake ID. And so this is a standard way of labeling patients in our system, which is basically a letter and then 4 numbers that come from one of their other identifiers. And what's important is to have individuals labeled in the same way for different databases. So if you have mortality and you have somebody named Jonathan Smith written down there and you're calling him John Smith here, they will not compute. But if it's like S0241 and that's the universal language you use for all your databases, it's really easy to take that identifier and look in another database for that. And so that's what we've done here. And so I've got my MET database here and I've got my mortality database here, same kind of person format, and here I have date of death, kind of a bunch of gobbledygook letters for names, and then location of where they died, hospice, on the ward, ICU, etc. So to bring in a date of death, or to ask my death database, did somebody die, and bring in the date of death, I use a command called v-lookup, and it goes like this. I'm going to say equals v-lookup, and then equals v-lookup, and then parentheses, and then this is what I wanted to look up to. So take B2106, and I'm going to type in a comma, and then go over here and look at this whole array of data from A2 on down to, it's actually D1426. I'm not going to scroll down and show that to you, but take that as an article of faith. And then I'm going to type another comma. So this is the brick of data. And if I get a match, I want it to return the value that is contained in this second column of data here. And so that's going to be 2 for value in the second column of data. And then I have to type a comma and the word false. I have no clue what the whole false thing's about, but that's the deal. And then I hit return, and look at this. I got a date of death. And look at this. My date column is configured as a number, so I'm just going to make things pretty easy to understand by converting it to a date. So now what I want to do is I want to copy this command and paste it all the way down, but I'm going to have a problem. When I copy this and paste it, when I paste it here, it's going to say, okay, we're looking for C1101, and then the problem is the data that it's looking at over here in the mortality database has done a downward frame shift. See, for row 2, it's gone from A2 to D1426 on the mortality column, and then when I pasted it, it slid down to A3 to 1427. Well, guess what? I want it to look at this whole array of data, because as I move down, I can't guarantee there's a great correspondence between one population of patients that died and another population that had met calls. I needed to look at the whole array of data regardless of what line of data this is on. So here's how I correct for that problem. I go back to my original formula, and if I type $signs in front of the A, the 2, the D, and the 1426, what I now have is I've anchored that data to that exact array of data, and as I cut and paste the formula up and down this row, the same group of data will be considered for every last entry. It will not do this frame shift where moving down one row here moves down one row here. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. So I'm going to go down to the bottom of the pile here, and I'm going to copy that, click shift, and then do a paste, and I've returned a bunch of dates of death here. So now what I'm going to do is I want to look at the interval between the date of death and the original MET call. And so for this column, I am going to just say equals date minus date and return a value. And I'm going to copy this formula on down the line and see what I get here. And so now I have numbers that reflect the number of dates between the date of mortality and the MET call, and you'll notice this guy here's a negative number, and I think that's because I was playing around with this date in a prior example. So now it's a positive number, and so now I have all this other gobbledygook that I don't really want, and so here I'll show you how to clean this up. First off, I'm going to, since the data that I want has been returned here, I'm going to first just copy all these things, and I'm going to paste the values so the formulas go away. And now that enables me to just have the computer take a look at this as a letter combination and do something with it, which is basically get rid of it. So I'm going to select these two columns. I am going to go to the replace command, and I'm going to say, okay, this hashtag n/a, wherever you see that, replace it with nothing. And when I do a replace all, basically all this other gobbledygook is going away. Since my intervals, I want to just look at whole numbers, I'm going to go to formula and select number and say no decimal places. And so now I've got a pretty good data set. I've got deaths when they've occurred, and I now have intervals between mortality and when the original MET call was. And I could do things like, say, just sort all this data and tell me who died within 30 days. And so pretty simple thing to do there. You can say, okay, take a look at the data, sort by this interval here, starting with small to low numbers. And now all this data has been returned here, and I can tell you that of the patients that died, we have just kind of like select the whole number there and do count, and there's 183 that have died between 0 and 30 days of a MET call. Not sure where this negative number comes from. I think it's sort of like a data entry example that has gone bad, but get the idea. So back to the formula. So for VLOOKUP, it's equals VLOOKUP, the item of interest, and then where your other data lies. And it's important to have the leftmost column of this whole array be an element that corresponds to the number of interest, or item of interest, meaning your identifier. And then the last part of the formula is what column you wanted to look to. So we had date of death in the second column, so it's going to be 2 for date of death, but it could easily be 3 location of death, column 3, or their name, column 4. And then you have to type in the word false, and then that gives you the data. And you can, it's not strictly one column of data that you can get. I could paste this formula across and return all the different data elements that are contained on the mortality database if I wanted to. Okay, a couple other formulas that are very useful to know, and first is conditional formatting, and this is a great way of turning words or letters into numbers. And the reason why you want to do that is if you can boil things down to dichotomous variables, this allows you to do more advanced sorting, allows you to do more advanced counting, and doing different ways and allows you different manipulations of kind of restricting searches on your spreadsheet to just items of interest. So here I have a column B that has a number of different reasons for calls, and here I just really want to know whether I have septic patients or not. So for this, in this box here, I've entered in the following formula. If, parentheses, B2, which is this element here, is sepsis, putting that in quotes, the comma, then put in the letter 1, number 1, and if there's no sepsis, put in 0. So I put that formula right here in this box, and then I copied it and pasted it, and going down the line, because B3 doesn't have the word sepsis, it's calling that a 0 because this is not sepsis, a 0, etc. And it's a great way of just being able to take items of interest and then create 0 to 1 column values that allow you to analyze for the presence or absence of that. And also when you get into multivariable analysis, if you do, being able to have things, different conditions listed as 0 to 1, whether it's male, female, medical, surgical, septic, not septic, daytime, nighttime, you name it, just being able to boil all those variables into 0 1s will be the next step in a lot of different types of analyses. So get to know that command and use it because it is a lot of fun and incredibly useful. Counting frequencies is also pretty important in some cases, and here we're using an example where we have different patients named A through M, and we've looked at numbers of admissions into the hospital, and we have a different, for each one we have a different number of readmissions within a given year. But in terms of looking at the kind of the epidemiology of readmissions and second admission rates, it's much more important to be able to say, okay, out of 13 patients, how many had single admissions, how many had 2 admissions, 3 admissions, and all that. And so here you use the formula, the Countif formula. So for this particular box, I typed in equals Countif, and then I select the array of data that I want to look at. So Countif, when looking at this whole array of data, you see the number 1. And then every time it sees this number 1, it'll count it. And you notice I have dollar signs here. And the reason is because as soon as I set up this formula here, what I wanted to do is just paste it for all these other rows here and be able to come into this row and say, okay, tell me how many times you see number 2, and for this one, number 3, this one, number 4, and this one, greater than 4. And so by just structuring the formula so that when I paste the formula up and down the line, the only thing I have to change is the 1, 2, 3, 4. That makes it super easy for me to set this up, and I'm not, for every individual destination cell, typing in this whole formula. And then what you could do is you can select this data and just plot it as a histogram, and so as your data changes, you can see that kind of the data that appears here changes, and then that data that is become part of the histogram changes. So I'll just kind of go back to where it was. Pretty cool, huh? Okay. And finally, going to filtering. And that is a command that enables you to take a look at a database and then restrict it to just one element of interest. So to put that description into a real example, here's my demo MET database, and let's say that I have patients here that are listed as medical, surgical, nursing, or other, and I have these different floors here. And so let's say I'm interested in, someone calls me up from the intermediate ICU and says, hey, how many of our patients get transferred to a higher level of care? And then I ask them, oh, are you interested in medical patients or surgical patients? And they say, oh, medical patients. So what I could do is go to this first row of data where I have my headers and create a filter. And so for Macintosh, it is Command-Shift-F. And all of a sudden, my data turns into having these weird looking triangles. If you haven't memorized that command for a Macintosh, you can go to Data, and then you go to the word filter there, and that will give you the same thing that, that I did with Command-Shift-F. And on a PC, I'm not exactly sure what pull-down menu it has, but on the home screen up to the right, there is a icon that looks like a funnel, and that's the filter command. And what that will do is turn your top row into these funny looking column elements that I'm going to show you here. And what those are a series of pull-down menus. So as we mentioned, when I click that, it shows me the names of all the data elements in there. And so I'm going to deselect all. And as I mentioned, I was interested in just those patients that were going to the intermediate ICU. So I've selected that, and look what's happened to my data here. It's only IICU data. And I'm also interested in just the medical patient. So I'm going to go over here to type of patient here. And those look like they're all medical patients. So we'll go to this one here. We'll deselect all, and we'll just identify the M patients. I think that's a more appropriate column to use. So now I've taken all my patients, and I've restricted them to only those in the ICU, and I've taken those patients and I've split them off into only the medical patients. And now what I could do is take a look at this transfer column where I have zeros and ones for whether they got transferred or not, and I can go down here and hopefully find the bottom of the pile. And in doing that, you can see that there's a count of 192 rows of data. And then if I select here and I ask it to tell me the sum, that's going to sum up the ones. So there are 86. So I know that my transfer rate equals 86 over 192, and I'm going to make my number format a couple decimal places so I can see what's going on. Okay, 45% of the medical patients in the intermediate ICU get transferred to a higher level of care after a med call. Pretty cool. So with filtering, basically I've gone from a pretty complex data set and I've just restricted it initially in one and then in a couple different dimensions to take, you know, several thousand lines of data and boil it down to just a very simple equation that could give me an answer pretty darn quickly. All right, so that's all I have for looking at databases in greater depth and some of the more complex operations. These are really useful in manipulating rapid response databases and arriving at some of the answers to questions that do come up quite commonly in this field. So I hope that helped.